Well, thank you. I'm Dr. Mark Moyer, the director of the Project on Military and Diplomatic History at CSIS. Some of you know we moved here over the summer after our first year on DuPont Circle, and we are in the midst of an intensive season of events on military and diplomatic history aimed at bringing historical understanding to the policy world and developing relationships between historians and the policy community. And I hope you can stick around after a bit, exchange business cards, because one of our objectives is just to facilitate longer-term relationships between groups. And our speaker today really straddles both of those. I want to mention a couple upcoming events in case you're available. October 18th, we're going to have Lawrence Freedman talking about his new book, The Future of War, A History. On October 24th, we will have Calder Walton speaking on the history of foreign interference in elections. And this will be here. And we also have a mailing list. If you're not signed up, you can find it on our website. I remember Anbar from at the time I was teaching at Marine Corps University, and we had been getting sort of unremitting bad news out of Anbar Province, and a lot of people were saying that the war is going to be lost. And General Conway came in to give a talk and suddenly started talking about all this great stuff that was happening in Anbar Province. And I think there was a fair amount of skepticism, but it turns out it was, in fact, the early stages of the Anbar Awakening, which, as you know, is a big part of the overall turnaround in the military situation there. It's already been used as a historical precedent or an example from history that policymakers used and was in particular applied in Afghanistan, which our speaker today also knows very well. Having spent some time in Afghanistan over the years, I was surprised how many times I showed up somewhere and found Carter Malkasian there. He seemed to be everywhere in the country, wherever one went. Carter has a doctorate in history of war from Oxford University. He's currently working as an advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But in 2003, he deployed to Iraq with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force as an advisor in counterinsurgency. Went back in February 2004 to February 2005. And again in February 2006 to August of 2006. And most of that time was spent in Anbar Province, which is the subject of this new book. He then went to Afghanistan 2007-2008 to lead a provincial reconstruction team in eastern Afghanistan. In 2009, he volunteered to be part of the civilian surge in Afghanistan. And unlike most members of the civilian surge, he was stationed out in a dangerous district. He learned Pashto. If you haven't seen already, there's a great article about this in the Washington Post, but there was a survey done towards the end of his time there of the residents of the district, and they found that he was considered the most influential person in the district ahead of the Afghan officials and tribal elders. And he wrote a book about that called War Comes to Garmsar. And Hugh Strawn, the British historian, said of that book, in the 19th century, Britain employed political officers on the troubled frontiers of its empire. They immersed themselves in their localities, learnt about the inhabitants, and heard their stories. Carter Malkasian is an American 21st century political officer. Outwardly, his deeply revealing book is about Afghanistan's experience of war over 3 decades, but is also a mirror on the U.S. itself. His message is clear. Deep historical and cultural understanding is at the heart of good strategy. I like that quote also because that gets to the core of what our mission here in promoting historical understanding. Carter's other books include A History of Modern Wars of Attrition, The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and a book co-edited with Daniel Marston entitled Counterinsurgency in Modern Warfare. And today he's going to talk about his newest book, Illusions of Victory, the Anbar Awakening and the Rise of the Islamic State. The book provides a provocative interpretation of one of the seminal events in early 21st century military and diplomatic history. Before we turn things over to Carter, I'm also going to introduce our discussant, who has come to us all the way from Australia. Dr. Daniel Marston, who has a doctorate in history from Oxford. He holds a professorship in military studies and is also the principal of the Military and Defense Studies program at the Australian Command and Staff College in Canberra. He previously held the Ike Skelton Distinguished Chair in the Art of War at the U.S. Army Command and Staff General Staff College, where I had the privilege of meeting with him. He's been a visiting fellow at the Changing Character of War program at Oxford, at the University of Oxford. He's been a special advisor in Iraq and Afghanistan with the U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, and the British Army. His book, Phoenix from the Ashes, an in-depth assessment of how the British and Indian Army turned defeat into victory in the Burma campaign of the Second World War, won the Field Marshal Templar Medal Book Prize in 2003. And he's also the co-editor of the book mentioned earlier, Counterinsurgency in Modern Warfare. So let me turn it over to Carter.
Mark, thank you very much for the great introduction. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be here today with everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and speak, to come and hear me talk. I think I should just say very quickly at the outset that the ideas I mentioned today and the conclusions I have, they're my own. They're not the conclusions of the U.S. government or DoD. They're just kind of my own thoughts when my own research has gone. When I first, when I had spent, as Mark said, quite a bit of time in Anbar province and got to have some kind of understanding, or half an understanding of what was going on and what our military operations were. And some of you I actually spent some time out there with. And when I got back, what I really wanted to do was write a history of the whole U.S. campaign in Anbar. And by this time, things were winding down, and I thought that would be a great thing for someone who's a historian to do. Now, I got a few chapters done, and then I got distracted and went to Afghanistan and spent all kinds of time in Afghanistan having all kinds of fun there. When I came back, I kind of stayed focused on Afghanistan and a variety of other issues until I started in my current job, which got me going back and forth to Iraq again. And in the course of doing that, I thought, well, what better way to refamiliarize myself with Iraq than read what I had written about it. And when I read it, I thought, well, you know, this isn't that far from a book. You should take a shot at it. And that's kind of how I came up with Illusions of Victory, which takes a different view of the Anbar Awakening, which looks at it from the perspective of today, rather than the perspective I would have written, which would have been about 2007, 2009. It might be useful to go to the next slide. If that's
clicker.
Oh, there's a clicker here. I'll just stand it. We're going to just keep going. So Anbar was one of America's greatest successes in Iraq and in the first decade of the 20th century. You're probably fairly aware that Iraq was a difficult place for us to be fighting from 2003 to 2006. We had to deal with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, the predecessor of the Islamic State, and they had made much of Iraq very violent. At one point, it looked like Baghdad was about to fall. Thank you very much. Then, in the middle of 2006, this movement appears in Anbar, in the city of Ramadi in particular, where a group of tribal leaders gets together and they rise up to combat and confront AQI. Over time, this movement grows, eventually pushes AQI back in Ramadi, then back from Anbar, and then the movement spreads, with a lot of help from General Petraeus, throughout Iraq. And so what Anbar became, and the Anbar Awakening became, was the point at which success started. And it became this critical battle, this critical moment, where we had great success and enabled things to change. It became a tipping point. So this experience, this tipping point, was then something that everyone wrote about, everyone talked about. Politicians spoke about it, policymakers spoke about it, scholars spoke about it, military officers spoke about it. The people who had been major players in this, such as General Petraeus, such as the very astute Colonel Sean McFarlane, his Arabist, his fluent Arabist, Travis Patriquin, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Journey, they all became names in this famous event of the Anbar Awakening. As we turn to Afghanistan, people use the Anbar Awakening as something that should be replicated. And even more lately in Syria, we've heard talk of the Anbar Awakening again and ways that it could be replicated and repeated so that, again, we could have a great success. Today, however, I don't think things look so bright. So in January 2014, the Islamic State rolls into Anbar province. They defeat what remained of the tribal awakening, defeat the government, besiege several cities, take over other cities. After that, they move on to Mosul and capture a lot of ground there. We've been forced to return to the conflict. We've been forced to get back involved. A threat return to the United States homeland of one degree or another. And so when you look at Anbar from that perspective, it no longer seems like the same kind of tipping point that it was in the past. And so I think with almost a decade distant now from what happened, we are much better able to understand the Anbar Awakening, understand its meaning, understand what it means for intervention, understand what it means for counterinsurgency in U.S. operations. And I think some people might say, well, is Anbar even worth remembering, given how much things have changed? And I think it is, because I think it does have these lessons for us about what we should expect out of an intervention or of an intensive counterinsurgency campaign. So I think we have to understand what's happened in Anbar, we have to talk a little bit about the Anbar Awakening again. And I don't want to spend too much time on it today. But to understand how things played out, we have to understand how things played out with the Islamic State. We have to understand a little bit about how things played out back from 2003 to 2007. So this, of course, is a map of Anbar Province. Anbar Province has about 1.5 million people in it. Desert, extremely hot. It's largely, almost entirely Sunni, with a variety of tribes throughout it. The people live along the Euphrates River Valley there in a series of cities. Fallujah has about 400,000 people, Ramadi about 450,000 people, and then smaller towns out to the west. Some of you are very familiar with Anbar already. So the insurgency started in 2003, shortly after U.S. forces arrived. Insurgent groups started attacking U.S. forces. This was a Sunni insurgency. And it had different parts to it. Part of it was the resistance, which was something that was formed of tribes and former military. Their aims tended to be a little bit more secular. And there was also this growing group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And there were other extremist groups that kind of connected them and glommed onto them. I'm going to call them all AQI for the sake of simplicity. These groups were slowly able to gain dominance over the insurgency as a whole. So as we see major battles happening in Fallujah, as we see elections pushed forward, while that's happening, AQI is starting to gain dominance. They're able to do this through a variety of reasons, but two reasons I want to give you right now is, first of all, they had an ability to offer people social mobility, and they had access to resources, to money, to weapons that enabled them to push aside some of the other insurgent groups and push aside the tribes to a certain extent. They could offer things to fighters and to young men that other groups could not. Now, the other thing that they were able to do is they were able to really capitalize on the idea that they were fighting the American occupier, and that they were doing so for Islam, whether or not one believes in what they were claiming to be Islam. They would use that to get more supporters. One of the things I remember very clearly having in Anbar is one day we were talking to an important religious leader from Fallujah, and I was there with Brigadier General Reist. And this was in 2006, and the religious leader had just gone through explaining to us how it's really only about 5% of the people of Anbar who were really extremists or foreign fighters. And so we kind of glommed onto that. And we said, well, 5%, so what's making this mere small 5% decide they want to fight us? And he said, whoa, you think 95% of people here like you? And there was just kind of, and there were a lot of other quotes like that, and there's a lot of polling to that effect too, but it was just kind of a reminder of how our presence caused antipathy throughout the population as a whole. So the situation in Ramadi was particularly grim. It was a place where The Al-Qaeda in Iraq had a lot of support. We have various report. One company commander told me how they would get in fights against 100 insurgents a day. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, but the idea that they were fighting daily was something that was certainly happening, and that plenty of other battalions seconded. So then, unexpectedly in that summer, this group of tribal leaders starts to rise up. And at first we don't really see it, and then it becomes more and more apparent that something's happening. They were upset with what AQI was doing. They decided that they were going to give some of have their young men join the police. They decided they'd form militias, and they would fight with AQI from time to time. The most famous of these leaders was Abdel Sattar from the Abarisha tribe. And he was about 40 or so years old. He was very aggressive. He controlled a variety of smuggling routes. And he really decided that he was going to take his tribe and some of the other surrounding tribes and fight AQI hard. And he looked the part. He liked wearing sheikh's robes. He carried an AK with it. He was wiry and goateed. He fit it right out of a movie. So in 14 September of 2006, he announced the formation of Sahwa al-Anbar, which means the Anbar Awakening, that announced there's going to be this awakening against al-Qaeda in Iraq for all the tribes to start moving against them. There we go. That gives you a closer view of the area, and some of the tribes that I'll be naming from time to time are listed there. You can see the Abarisha tribe there just by Ramadi. So why did these tribes decide to stand up against AQI? What made them decide that they want to do this? So publicly, they spoke of the oppression of AQI and the need to get rid of their violence. Sattar says in an interview about this time, terrorists claim that they were fighters working on liberating Iraq, but they turned out to be killers. Now all the people are fed up and have turned against them. Now, I would argue that the reality is much less idealistic than this. The reality was that AQI was diminishing and marginalizing the tribes. It was stepping on their smuggling routes, stepping on their ability to get money. It was taking their tribesmen and attracting them to their organization versus the loyalty of the tribal leader of the sheikh. So the sheikh had much more difficulty exerting his power and maintaining his status in society. They also, in addition to doing this, there's a variety of other factors that play an important role. For example, the growing role of the Shia government, of a Shia-dominated military, and the possible influence of Iran. So I don't want to simplify the reasons that people stood up, but I don't want to get into detail now. I think we can talk about it during the question and answer. The one thing I would bring up here is to point out that what I am pointing out here, this clash for power between AQI and the tribes, is not really about AQI's brutality. AQI was very brutal. AQI did kill sheikhs, they used chemical weapons, they did execute people and cut people's heads off. But most of these events happened after this clash had already begun, after tribes had already decided they were going to stand up against AQI. And particularly the most brutal events happened at that time. Now, without a doubt, this brutality probably inspired more people to fight, probably prevented any kind of compromise with AQI, probably catalyzed the awakening. But that's a much more subtle and nuanced understanding. And so why am I taking the time to explain this? Because I think the focus on brutality and the idea that AQI was simply evil and doing evil things, I think that made us a little bit less attentive to the possibility that they could come back. Because when they're viewed in that kind of brutality, then one thinks, well, naturally the people of Anbar are going to rise up against them. No one wants to live under that. And it also makes you think that the tribal leaders themselves, the members of the awakening, it makes one think of them as good, as that they're always doing the right thing. So what you end up doing is underestimating the depth of support that AQI had in society, while overestimating the support that the tribal leaders have. And I think that's one factor as to why we didn't realize that the awakening might not have been as lasting as we would have wanted it to be. So we give a lot of support to the awakening. Colonel Sean McFarland understood what was happening, knew he had to jump on an opportunity, and he made sure he gave them assistance. That included money, included force protection measures, such as making sure their men had radios, or even putting a tank next to their home, allowing police stations to be built in the tribal areas so that these tribal areas could be better protected. All of this helped move them forward. The Marines and soldiers on the ground also instituted a lot of new, very innovative tactics, using some of the best lessons learned to put outposts spread out as far as they could be spread out, to patrol heavily, to live and train and work with the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police. These are valuable lessons that were attained. Slowly, the tribal movement grew. By March 2007, it encompassed nearly every tribe in the city of Ramadi. Meanwhile, AQI's losses got heavier and heavier and heavier. For 6 months, they managed to keep the number of attacks going on in Anbar pretty steady. But in the end of March, it broke. It went from about 70 attacks per day down to something like 40 attacks per day. And then after that, the number of attacks dropped even further in Anbar province. That spreads after that into the rest of Iraq, where the Sons of Iraq program, where General Petraeus managed to recruit about 100,000 Sunni militia, and helped enable Baghdad to be put into a much more secure position. So at the end, by mid-2007 or so, the situation in Anbar has changed dramatically. And it's a situation that to many Marines is surreal. They can walk openly on the streets of Ramadi. They can go and get food easily. There was even, I think it was in 2008, there was a marathon, or a 5-mile marathon, a 5-mile race, run through the streets of Ramadi. There was still some violence. There's IEDs, suicide car bombs, and there's some tragic losses, including Sattar himself, who was killed in September 2007, just a few days after he had been televised sitting right beside President Bush at a meeting. But the awakening movement at that early point did not go away. It still was able to sustain itself because it was sufficiently strong to do so. The tribes really had a different problem than security at this point. The problem the tribes had was the effects of working so close to the Americans was coming back to bite them. You can see in polling that many people didn't really have a lot of confidence in their local leaders at that time. There's one ABC News poll that found a mere 23% of respondents in Anbar had confidence in their local leaders. So some degree of sympathy for AQI and some degree of antipathy towards America lived on during this time. And a number of locals would accuse the awakening leaders of having been stooges or spies. One of the major leaders in Ramadi had his street spray painted "Street of the Lackeys" on it. So it's just important to remember that this undercurrent is going on as we had a period of some amount of quiet in the province. Now it's really full-scale violence really starts to return in 2012 and 2013. There's two interlocking events in this. One of the events is our withdrawal. So we start to withdraw from Iraq, and as we withdraw from Iraq, that means the tribal leaders aren't getting the same kind of money, aren't getting the same kind of military support as they formerly did. Also, some of the sectarianism of the government is allowed to surge forward, and that's the second thing that's important, this sectarianism that comes out of the government. The sectarianism there actually didn't start with our withdrawal. There have been events before that, but it really gets moving at that point, because Maliki, who's the prime minister, he goes and starts to take prisoner, or imprison, various key Sunni leaders. And for a year or so, this doesn't affect Anbar. But in December 2012, he imprisons Rafi al-Asawi, a famous hero from the days of the Battle of Fallujah. And that causes protests to start inside of Anbar province, inside of Ramadi and inside of Fallujah, where the people are coming to the streets demanding that that Sunnis be given greater rights, that these raids stop, and that the government stop being so sectarian. This puts the tribal leaders, the leaders of the awakening, in a dilemma. Under this kind of pressure where the people are upset at the government, they can no longer be so aligned with the government. Because if they're aligned with the government, their people will reject them. So most of those leaders had to distance themselves from the government. Distancing themselves from the government, though, means even less money and less support to maintain their power. Then, by opening things up to protests and being part of that, what they've done is opened up the competitive political space. So now, instead of the small elite being able to fairly control a large number of people, now you have to allow politicians to speak, you have to allow religious leaders to speak, you have to allow people that might support AQI to speak. So the tribal leaders are in a much more difficult position to hold on to their power. So in this environment, AQI, now renamed the Islamic State by their new Caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, by future Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, reemerge as a major player in Iraq. They start to take part in these protests. Their flags are flying in Ramadi, their flags are flying in Fallujah. The tribal leaders have a difficult time confronting them or contesting them because it will ruin their own, damage their own legitimacy. A leading tribal leader put it, the question of 2013 and 2014 that every sheikh faced was, is fighting the Islamic State a possibility if doing so is in support of a Shia government and against Islam? In December 2013, clashes with the government start to get out of control. There's yet another important leader, is Ahmed al-Alwani, is arrested, and that makes clashes just start to break out and get much, much worse. In these clashes, the army doesn't fare so well against the police and the tribal fighters and some of the other protesters who were there. And at that moment, the Islamic State decides to take advantage of the situation. At that moment, they make their move to seize Fallujah, to make their move to seize Ramadi, and to take other parts of Anbar over. So cells within the cities rise up, make moves on the police stations, the army bases, the government centers, and also there's footage of large numbers of Islamic State forces coming over the border. So they're coming from the outside in the deserts where they've been hiding, and then also the insides of the cities where they'd been setting up cells. The tribes don't hold together against this. A few tribes, some of the original members of the awakening, such as the Abu Risha tribe, they still fight. They go to the government, and they realign with the government to fight the Islamic State. Other tribes go ahead and side with the Islamic State. These are some of the tribes who often had been oppressed by the elite of the awakening, who had often had lost some of their power under that, so they felt that they had a reason to go towards the Islamic State. There were other people who were simply in competition with the leaders. They hadn't been marginalized, they simply wanted political power, and they thought going along with the Islamic State could get them there. And then there were plenty who just stood on the sidelines and tried not to get involved. Now the result, though, is that there wasn't a united front, which is kind of a familiar tale if one is studying tribes. And the Islamic State was able to take over all of Fallujah and most of Ramadi. Ramadi lasts for about until May 2015. So it manages to stand up until the Islamic State throws 12 suicide car bombs against the major facilities in the city, and that cracks the defense there. You know that in June 2014, Mosul fell, and all the bad things happened toward the gates of Baghdad. And the United States got back involved again. The United States got back involved with airstrikes, got back involved with having advisors that went back and tried to support the Iraqi army, much less the Iraqi police. And we got ourselves into the extended conflict that is just now apparently seems to be wrapping up to some extent. The thing I think that's important here is that even though the fight in Iraq has gone well, after several years and after no shortage of hardship, we still have the situation where the successes of the awakening didn't really last, where we found ourselves confronted with a threat, where we found ourselves having to put forces back in. I mean, the idea of the awakening as a tipping point is you don't have to put U.S. forces back in to continue to fight this war. And it became clear that the war was a much larger event. So, in spite of this, that's not to say the history of the awakening is devoid of value. On the contrary, I think there's a lot that we should remember from it. So the first thing that should be remembered are some of the things that our military forces accomplished. So some of the things that we should copy: the willingness to experiment, the willingness to try new innovative techniques. Colonel Sean McFarland's method for clearing and holding Ramadi, for helping the tribes, and then trying to do as much good counterinsurgency tactics as possible. I think that's a model for future people to use, for future soldiers, future officers, future Marines to use. General Neller, who's now Commandant of the Marine Corps, who tirelessly lobbied the Iraqi government to make sure they were paying the tribal fighters, to make sure they were paying the police. That is something that any commander trying to work and establish local forces is probably going to find themselves doing. These kind of examples, and then of course the very tactical detail of what the Marines are doing on the ground, patrolling every day, setting up outposts, working side by side with the Iraqi army and police. All of these things are examples that one should want to use. Sometimes I get mildly frustrated when people just you say the word counterinsurgency and people throw the whole thing out entirely. Well, saying counterinsurgency shouldn't necessarily mean that one thinks you have to be in a long, costly intervention somewhere. There's a variety of tactics and elements of it that are important, that are applicable in a variety of situations when one is facing insurgents or terrorists, which we often find ourselves facing. Now that said, though those tactical innovations are valuable, focusing on them is kind of out of step with the perspective of today. Because the perspective of today, I think, would redirect the initial interpretation of the awakening and the U.S. military campaign in Anbar. The perspective of 2007 to 2012 was that Anbar was this tipping point, and it was a foremost example of how counterinsurgency and U.S. intervention can succeed. Whether we're talking about U.S. forces making a big difference in a surge, or whether we're talking about the tribes rising up to AQI, the lesson was the same. We had a large, significant success. But this interpretation, I think, doesn't fit with today very well. It's hard to use the awakening to justify that military intervention in broken countries can lead to quick success or long-lasting success, even if you have large numbers that you're deploying. So I think instead, Anbar is an example of how success may be fleeting, may be evanescent. So this interpretation, though, means we should pay even more attention to Anbar, because it still matters a great deal. If a case in which it appears that we came so close to success, if a case that was so hailed didn't meet the mark, then what that becomes is an indication of, what that does is underline how intervention is something that takes a long time, that if when you leave, the successes may fall apart. It's something that's costly. This leading example of intervention counterinsurgency was bound to deeper sectarian, cultural, and political factors. And these factors, in the end, were insensitive to U.S. presence that was temporary. You could change things for a time, but once we left, those dynamics reappeared and drove things back towards the direction they were formerly going. Anbar exemplifies how intervention itself is a costly long-term project, and how success may only be sustained through a prolonged commitment of troops. So, such a long-term commitment, that should affect how policymakers think about intervention. If one knows the commitment is going to be long, and it could be costly, then that should make people think, that should give people pause. Maybe we don't want to intervene in the first place. Maybe this is going to be too difficult if we're not willing to stick it out. Now, on the other hand, in cases where the interest is of great stake to the United States, and it matters a great deal, then we should probably be thinking about, well, this means we're going to stay here have to stay a long time. And we should probably be biasing ourselves towards strategies that are sustainable, thrifty, manageable, something that we could carry on for a long time, not something that we're going to have to get out quickly and then see our successes disappear. And the last thing I'd say is that this also means that if you're in an intervention and you're thinking about getting out, you might not want to expect your successes to last. You might understand or think about the possibility that it's going to fall apart, and moreover, that history suggests it probably will fall apart if you leave entirely. Realism at the end of an intervention is almost as important as realism at the beginning of an intervention. So those are all the points I wanted to make here about AMBAR and what it means today. I know we're going to have some questions here. And I mean, obviously, I still consider it to be a very important case, one that continues to deserve study. And so thank you for your time.
So, Dr. Morse.
Okay, thank you for that, Carter. I'm just going to cover off on sort of my perceptions of the book itself very quickly and sort of summarize what I feel the core message of the book is directly from a paragraph that Carter wrote towards the end. I think the key question that Carter is really getting at in this book, which I think is fundamental, is to what end? Because when I was in Baghdad in 2007, a lot of the stuff we saw in AMBAR and the Awakening and other things, a lot of us were asking, to what end? In a sense, it seems like there's tactical successes, but is it tied to the strategic end state that's viable in terms of both Iraqi national interest as well as U.S. national interest? So that was an important thing that I saw come out of the book, which is extremely important. I do think this is an extremely important book because Carter attacks this with really in-depth critical analysis about the key debates of 06 and 07 with reflection. A lot of us would have said certain things in 06 and 07 based upon our time there. And as historians, we have to be careful sometimes of forecasting the future. So it was important to see Carter come back to this a number of years later and apply that reflection part of it. Which then leads me to this core issue that there are a lot of narratives, of course, about 06 and 07 that I do think need to be tested in terms of the way that the military as well as policymakers have viewed what actually happened in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. And it's really important, and it's not easy to do, especially for people who were there and people who were tied to the campaigns themselves. But Carter's always been able to do this, I think. I mean, I've known Carter for a long time now. We used to read each other's PhDs, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But Carter really did apply to me critical analysis to events that he was involved with or was a participant from one step aside, which is very hard to do because a lot of people who are tied in the middle of these campaigns sometimes can't reflect as well. And I think Carter in the book really came clearly through that you had stepped away and you were able to apply that. And again, he's done this in a coherent fashion. The narrative is excellent. It doesn't get bogged down in huge footnotes and things like that that some of us can be guilty of, as we know. And I think it flows extremely well. I do think the whole discussion of Ramadi is really the core of this book. And then the depth of analysis itself on the tribal dynamics is a core bit of it. Now, I will say, for some of the people in the room know that Carter and I do know each other quite well, we're good old friends, but I will say we are actually really critical with one another. We rip each other apart sometimes with our reports coming out of theater and also our books. So when I say that it was an excellent book, I'm actually not being nice. I'm actually saying that I did actually see it that way. So I will leave it with this one key paragraph, I feel, from the book that summarizes everything in it. Quote, a realistic appraisal of the U.S. effort in Ramadi and the Awakening would be that over the short term, it yielded a temporary and uneasy stability. Over the long term, it yielded a residual tactical opposition to the Islamic State. After stability collapsed, the remnants of the Awakening movement delayed Islamic State success with a spirited, if inadequate, defense of their territory. Without the U.S. effort in the Awakening, AMBAR could have lost 5 or so years of uneasy stability, and the Islamic State may have had an easier time emerging. This is a much more modest assessment of the impact of the awakening and the U.S. effort in Anbar than the traditional one of the lasting tipping point. That is not to say that the history of the awakening is devoid of value. With that last point, I would like to ask Carter, one thing that we've always debated is this issue of context. Because we've seen a lot how people have cherry-picked many campaigns, not just Anbar, but other campaigns, to try to pigeonhole them to a solution in the campaigns we're fighting in. But how important do you see context when you're actually in the midst of assessing a campaign and then 10 to 15 years later looking back on the campaign? How important is context to you?
Well, context is tremendously important. One of the problems is that the context one thinks is important in 10 years ago may not turn out to be the context that is important 10 years later. So it seems to me the context such as, the context I think that I should have gripped better over time was U.S. domestic politics and the costs of the interventions. I think those are contexts that were often mixed. Now, domestic politics doesn't necessarily mean you're going to leave. It may mean it's going to send you somewhere. But I think it's a context I could have paid much better attention to. I mean, but the thing about all of this is that when you're going into a country as an outsider and you're trying to learn as much as you can learn about that country, and you're still trying to pay attention to the wider context of what's going on domestically, internationally, you, as an outsider, you always don't know enough. You always are lacking in information. You know, even with Afghanistan, where my language skills are far and away better than anything I ever had in Iraq, even in Afghanistan now, I'm always learning something that I realize is crucial, and that and that I probably made a mistake, say a year ago or 2 years ago, that if I had known this piece of information, I wouldn't have made that mistake. So you're always at a disadvantage. The problem is that you have to make decisions. You can't wait forever. And so you get in this if you don't know, you could make a bad decision. But if you don't make a decision, you could miss the golden hour. You could make mistakes that later on mean that, well, you waited to figure out if you should build an army or not. You didn't build an army, the insurgents came and took everything over. So those are those problems there. So the advice I can give is that try to take in as much information as is possible. And in the information you do take in, when you're taking information, making a decision, try not to dismiss information because it fits one's preconceptions or what one wants to do. Try to correct as much as possible the decisions that are being made by the information coming in, and try to maximize the information you're bringing in, given what your time constraints are.
Carter, I want to ask you a quick question, then we'll open up to the audience. You talked a bit about the American withdrawal and how that facilitated the rise of ISIS. Do you think if the U.S., I think one lesson people draw from that is America needs to be willing to stay in for at least longer than it has been. If U.S. forces hadn't pulled out so quickly, and if the U.S. government had maybe taken a more activist role instead of kind of turning everything over to Maliki, do you think things would have turned out differently in Anbar?
So I think what I'd say is that if we had stayed, what it shows if we had stayed, yes, it's possible that we might have been able to keep things down better. I don't want to get too much into a political debate on things, but it's possible. But the lesson from that is not necessarily that we should have done that. The lesson is that if you get into an intervention like this, you can expect to pay the costs of trying to keep things down for a long time. And if you're not willing to keep those costs, things are going to go back to a different way. They're going to reverse themselves. That's not really to say that in the book I don't really talk about the drawdown decision, if it was right or wrong. It's not something that I tackle head on. It's merely to say if you want whatever successes they are that you attained, if you want them to keep going, you're probably going to have to keep presence going for a long time too. It doesn't necessarily have to be hundreds of thousands of men or tens of thousands of men, but you're probably going to have to keep some kind of presence to prevent things from going bad. Now that of course brings up all kinds of other questions too. It brings up all kinds of other questions about, well, what kind of interest could make the United States want to stay somewhere for decades? Another question people could say, well, isn't that colonialism? Isn't that something the United States doesn't want to be involved in at all? Those are all very fair questions. And in this book, I do not fully tackle those questions.
Thanks. And by the way, for those watching on the webcast, you can tweet your questions to @CSISPMDH. To open it up now to the audience for questions. Sir, we've got a microphone over here.
My name is Suleiman Wasti. I was representing the UN in Iraq in 2011-2012, and I was evaluating the reconstruction efforts. My question pertains to the role of the federal government in Baghdad. Let's move forward today. What's happening in Mosul? Today there is a pictorial by Ali Arkadi, who has documented the Iraqi elite forces, how they are butchering and killing and torturing the civilians in Mosul. And I urge everybody to see that. It's heartbreaking. It makes Abu Ghraib like a pizza party. So it's something which they have always treated the governorates and provinces, the federal government in Baghdad, not so much as the US. I mean, this is their own people, how they're treating them. And I think this is something which needs to be documented. Thanks for letting me share.
What's the name of the documentary again?
Sorry?
What's the name of the documentary again?
It's in the Toronto Star of today.
Okay.
It's Ali Arkadi, who was embedded as a journalist, and it's available. It's very graphic violence, how they are treating the civilians in Mosul, who after when ISIS moved away, and how. So that's again an ISIS in the making. If I'm a 20-year-old Iraqi, which actually my last name is Wasti, it's a governorate in Iraq, Wasit. So if you're a 20-year-old Iraqi who has seen nothing but sanctions and war, and you see, you only get, in the country which is the 4th largest producer of oil, you only get 4 hours of electricity, you have all the incentive to join ISIS.
Yeah.
So this was in the making.
All right, next question. Gentleman in the second row here.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I wonder if you could say something about the evolution of the counterinsurgency doctrines, because I know there was a period, say 2008, there was a very popular doctrine that everybody was adopting, and then that was discarded rather abruptly and went down in flames. But going back, actually what I'm specifically myself interested in is General McChrystal, when he was there, had this very well-known 24-hour cycle of fighting the terrorists, where you would raid a terrorist hideout or whatever, get the information, process the information overnight, and the very next day you'd be making the next raid on the basis of that information. And apparently that had something to do with the fact that he was able to terminate Zarqawi. So, and yet once we moved up into Obama, there were a lot of restrictions put on that, so that you basically couldn't carry out that 24-hour cycle because you had to get permission from higher up before you could carry out these raids that he was carrying out, with the local authority, on his own local authority. And now, this is the end, so that's the question. Now we seem to be going back again, because it would appear that from his statements that President Trump has given General Mattis and then down the line much more freedom to conduct this type of raid without having to go to the various highest levels to get everyone micromanaged, approved. So is there any tendency here, or is this just sort of a merry-go-round of doctrines?
So I actually see development in doctrine over time. So I'd say that what you saw, so in 2003 to 2007-8, actually probably take it all the way to the end of Afghanistan, 2011, you saw counterinsurgency and counterterrorism methods develop. And they had, let's put them into 3 strands. One of them was what was going on the ground with most of the Marine and Army infantry units, the kind of the patrolling, the working with the patrolling, the outposts that I had mentioned. That's protecting the population. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was working with the local forces, trying to train with them and operate with them as closely as possible. Third element would be the counterterrorism activities, which is some of the things that you've talked about. Now, so what happened over time was it was the first of these that is rather resource intensive. So the first of these, as we decreased our resources, this dropped off, and we do less of that now because of the way that we operate. And especially counterinsurgency in terms of putting large numbers of troops on the ground in places for long periods of time, you're right, that has become, that is no longer a policy or a strategy that we wish to, that is no longer a strategy that we wish to pursue in pursuit of our policy goals. However, the other two elements have remained quite strong. When you look at what we've done in Afghanistan and Iraq, trying to work with the local forces to train them and give them support has been one of the primary efforts that we've been involved in. The other aspect of it has been the counterterrorism aspect. And yes, there are some differences between how that's been conducted over time, but it has remained a very important part of our strategy and one that is not criticized. So what I see is a development of counterinsurgency, call it what you will, away from something that is very heavy and having a lot of forces on the ground, something that's much more involved with using local forces and exploiting our counterterrorism prowess and expertise.
More questions? The lady in the blue, please.
Thank you. Marina Ottaway with the Wilson Center. If I'm trying to remember the dates now, it's difficult, but the first election, I think it was 2009, after the success of the Amber Awakening.
Yes.
There are a number of the leaders of the Awakening try to run for the parliament. And they are, if I remember, they are sprinkled among the various coalitions, right? And none of them does very well in the elections. In other words, it seems to me that there is a failure to translate the success they had, let's say, on the battlefield into political influence. And I am wondering to what extent that this is what is part of the reason why the success is undone, in the sense that it really does not, the success does not contribute to more representation for the Sunnis at the political level, which is one thing that they were very dissatisfied with. Do you care to comment?
So on the provincial level, they were able to translate that into political power, because there was provincial elections that occurred, which gives them control of the governor, control of a certain amount of money. So that was effective. The next year, they did not have the same kind of success in the parliamentary elections, which of course then lead to who's going to become prime minister. But this part of that wasn't so much that the Sunnis in general didn't get representation. It was how Maliki worked it afterwards to make sure that he stayed in power, because the Sunnis were actually aligned with the winning with the winning party. They had aligned themselves with the bloc that had succeeded. But with Alawi's bloc, but Maliki delayed that, and there was a big political gridlock after that happened, a lot of debate that was happening. But Maliki managed to delay any kind of decision long enough for that bloc to fragment and long enough for him to take back over, which left the Sunnis with less influence. But the bottom line of what you're saying, that the Awakening had trouble getting as much political influence as perhaps it might have, I think there's some ground to that. I think there's some weight to that.
Gentleman in the front.
Thank you. Bo Wilcox from the Osgood Center. My question pertains to the history of countering violent extremism. So today, the security sector is going through many reforms about how to provide countering violent extremism through economics and political, and well, that's a whole other batch of ideas. But I just wanted to know, when the military approached these tribal groups to fight against the insurgent groups, was there some kind of CVE element within this approach? Or moreover, did it just boil down to, come help us fight the bad guys and we'll train you and you'll have some place in the government?
So CVE, we didn't use the term CVE back then. But there were a lot of elements of what we would call CVE we call CVE today that were present back then. So, I mean, the goal was to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which we saw as connected to Al-Qaeda, that was, we thought at that time, I think there's some truth to it, that they would have had aims against our homeland. So there was a CD element there. There were CD elements of it in terms of we were hoping that the tribal leaders would also work with the religious leaders to speak against violence, that they would use projects and things to get people doing cash for work, so that they'd have jobs, so they'd be less attracted to working with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So all those elements were there, but they weren't explicitly called CVE then. And there certainly was a common goal between the tribal leaders and us, that we were both had terrorists in the crosshairs. So that would also be similar to CVE today. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
In the back?
I'm Perry Kamak with the Carnegie Endowment. Thanks for interesting presentation. You had mentioned, you spoke a little bit about the sectarian element of it. I wanted to kind of press you just a bit on the ethnic component to it, maybe not in Anbar, but in the situation generally. As I recall, kind of back to 2011, 2012, some of the early resurgence of, I guess, what was then called the ISI actually happened in Diyala province, and a lot of it was kind of, obviously there was a sectarian element, but there's also this kind of Kurdish Arab element to it as well. One, I wonder, given your experience as Anbar, how those kind of ethnic tensions were perceived in Anbar, which, as you mentioned, is almost overwhelming, I guess almost 100% Arab. But then kind of fast forwarding, obviously some of the tribal groups you write about in the book have connections in Nineveh province, in Diyala province. They may be kind of far removed from these internal boundaries issues, but I'm just wondering to the extent to which these kind of ethnic tensions were resonating then, but really are resonating now that the Kurds have kind of been empowered by the fight against the successors in the form of ISIL.
So it was there, but it didn't resonate as much then. I mean, it was the sectarian in the Iran, the Shia issue that dominated by far back in 03 to 07. Now, it's not to say that there was friction with the Kurds when Kurdish units came through. The Iraqis and the Sunnis didn't necessarily like them. There were biases against Kurdish interpreters that were there. But we also rarely got in conversations about what do you think about there being an independent Kurdistan. And usually when we talked about when we asked them then, what about if there was a federal Iraq? What if things split apart into different groups? They at that time would say, oh no, we're one Iraq, we're one nation, we've always been together. Now part of this was just repeating Saddam's line. It's the Ba'athist regime saying that more than it was a real love for the Shia, I would say. But we just didn't get into those conversations, and we didn't see it as much. In my research and what I've seen lately on how the Islamic State returned to Anbar, I also didn't see that much on the Kurdish aspect there. Now, today, if we go and have conversations about what's the thought about independent Kurdistan, yes, people are not very happy about that. And that absolutely has become a bigger issue now than before. Now, I wasn't in Diyala, but what you're saying about Diyala makes perfect sense to me and rings with some of the things I've heard in the past, but I'm not an expert on Diyala by any means.
Gentleman, third row.
Thank you. Both Illusions of Victory and War Comes to Garmser place a pretty heavy emphasis on local politics and power struggles compared to a lot of other literature that covers the Awakening and similar events. And you see that theme expressed in a couple other places. And it seems like there's a unifying theme among the authors that they stay in the area for more than a year or have conversations with the same Iraqis or Afghans for more than a year, and they speak the local language, if not fluently, then enough to have a conversation. Do you think the U.S. military's personnel policies for language training and rotational tempos in Iraq and Afghanistan have hindered awareness of local politics and power struggles?
Yes, they probably have. I mean, the rotations over time, even if a unit is there for 1 year, it makes things more difficult. There are some things that have been done that can help mitigate that. If certain staff elements are there for a year, then that helps a great deal. I personally think having civil affairs officers or foreign area officers stay for a longer amount of time, or even certain intelligence personnel stay for a longer amount of time, that could help. There is a real exhaustion issue. Being there beyond 18 months is exhausting. And it's different. Some people can go longer. Some people go for a very long amount of time. But you just have to be aware that that exhaustion issue is there. And so people can start to lose effectiveness over time because of that.
We have time for one quick last question. Claire?
So I wonder, Claire Rousseau, I'm an independent consultant, but I wonder if you can talk about the success and failure of the awakening in the context of strategy beyond just the military, looking at it diplomatically and through the eyes of development. How did those two lines of effort contribute to the short-term successes and the long-term failure? Meaning, were the development efforts that took place in Anbar even worthwhile, and did they play much role at all in the success or even the beginning of the awakening? But also, how those two lines of effort affected the outcome ultimately.
So it was the development line of effort, and what was the first line of effort?
Diplomacy.
The diplomacy line of effort. So the development line of effort, without a doubt, was extremely important. If it wasn't for the civil affairs funding that was supporting the awakening, it would have been difficult for them to have the funding that they needed. They would have had a more difficult time winning back the allegiance of some of their tribesmen. I'm almost pushed so far to say it was a necessary condition that if you took it out, the thing would have failed. I'm not quite certain it's quite that much, but it's extremely important. It played a major role. Now, it may not play the role in the way that we traditionally think about it. There wasn't the kind of USAID activity there was in Afghanistan at a local level, and so what you're really talking about is military civil affairs work that was happening. But it was vital, and if I was to take it to Afghanistan or somewhere else, I would say the USAID activity is vital and is helpful when it's pushed in that direction. The diplomatic activity was also important in Anbar. Now, of course, the diplomatic activity was very limited. There were very few people doing it. So they played an important role, like K.O. Weston played an important role mitigating the backlash that could be occurring from some of our operations, reaching out to locals, getting community councils set up. So that played an important role too, although admittedly, Anbar was heavily militarized.
What about at the national level, though? I mean, our diplomatic efforts and development in terms of governance, as we see it in Afghanistan, and in terms of the integration of the Sunnis into the political sphere enough such that, maybe you can withstand the Maliki political maneuvering or that sort of thing?
So I think there's no doubt diplomacy is important in that. And that's a role for governance activity and diplomatic activity to take. It takes a long presence there. It takes managing the problem for year after year, and it takes a focus on that. And whenever we get involved in a country's internal activities, we get rightly cautious that there could be a backlash about it. But you have to balance that against what's going to happen if the Sunnis aren't taken care of, or whatever group is going to have too many problems. What happens if they are too oppressed? So you have to judge when it's necessary to lean in. But you can only lean in if you have good diplomats on the ground. If you don't have that on the ground, you can't lean in at all. And then you're almost bound to have some degree of failure. So.
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Some of you may know we were originally scheduled for a later time frame, and H.R. McMaster and Henry Kissinger decided they wanted to come here, and so we need to get out of this room so that they can set up for that. But everyone, please get your business cards out. We can head out into the foyer here and continue the discussion, but please join me in a round of applause for a great speech from Carter Malkasian.